Hi everyone, wish you all a very pleasant evening. Can I say hi? Today actually we are planning with Norma Basalis. Norma Basalis, as you all know, among all the other Norma Basalis is a bit tough because hi Shiv Kumar, hi Shilson, hi Menti, hi Jaita, hi Abhi. So very good evening to one and all. I'll come to the chat later. We'll start with the topic. So Norma frontalis, Norma frontalis we have already seen, Norma verticalis, Norma basalis, Norma lateralis, Norma occipitalis. So these are the different views of the skull. So among all these Norma, we know that Norma basalis is a bit tough. That's the reason why I think most of you have asked me to do a session on Norma basalis. And it's not easy to do this entire session. It's easy to do, but it's difficult to understand. Okay, so if I say everything in one go. So what I'm planning to do is I will be doing this session in 2 sessions. Okay. In today's session, what I'm planning to do is I will deal with half of the topic and I'll be mentioning just the important landmarks. And in the next session, we will finish it up by seeing the attachment and the structures passing through it. Hope it's clear. So, and again, Norma Basalis is one of the favorite questions for most of the examiners, and especially for Viva, you will be given this Norma Basalis and you will be just asked to speak on it. So that's the favorite. So once you know this Norma Basalis, that means you know something about the skull. So that is the viewpoint from the examiner's perspective. So let's start Norma Basalis. First and foremost thing is you need to say the boundaries of Norma Basalis. So first of all, what is Norma Basalis? We know that it is the view of the skull from the inferior aspect. The skull is like this. It is the view of the skull from the inferior aspect. And one important point you have to add is it is the view without the mandible. We have removed the mandible, right? But Norma frontalis and all, we have seen the mandible along with it. But in Norma basalis, it is the view of the skull as if you view from the inferior aspect without the mandible. That is the first and foremost point you have to remember. Now, we have to say about the boundaries of Norma basalis. That is, till where you include the part of the skull into this view. Okay, so anteriorly you have the incisors, isn't it? These are the incisors, the sockets for the incisors. So anteriorly you have the incisor teeth. Posteriorly, you can see the superior nuchal line. Okay, this is the external occipital protuberance and you can see the superior nuchal line. So anteriorly you have the incisor teeth and posteriorly you have the superior nuchal line. So these are the anterior and posterior boundaries. Coming to the lateral boundary, how far laterally you need to go when you mention about the Norma basalis. That means you can include the alveolar arch with rest of the tooth socket, isn't it? Then you can go with the zygomatic arch. This is the zygomatic arch, isn't it? So the rest of the teeth, the sockets, then you have the zygomatic arch. Then you can see this is the posterior root of zygoma. You can see this is a zygomatic process and this is the anterior root. Here we call it as the anterior root and this is the posterior root. Hope this is clear. So you have the zygomatic arch, then you have the posterior root of zygoma, then followed by the mastoid process. This is the mastoid process. So this is about the lateral boundary. Okay, so once again, anteriorly you have the incisors, posteriorly you have the superior nuchal line, and laterally the remaining tooth sockets. Then you have the zygomatic arch, then you have the posterior root of zygoma, then followed by the mastoid process. This is how you say about the boundary, the main boundary. Good evening, good evening. The main boundary of the Norma basalis. Hope that is clear. Now, the next important point is when you start speaking about Norma basalis, you can see there are many features you have to start with. So you need to know from which point you need to start, or you should have an idea to how to put this information in front of your examiner, isn't it? For that, we actually divide the Norma Basalis into three portions: the anterior portion, the middle portion, and the posterior portion. Okay, so that we can go one by one and we can say the details of each. Okay, so this is not a hard and fast rule, but it will be easy for you if you study like this: the anterior portion, the middle portion, and the posterior portion. Okay. So anterior portion, which all part you will include in the anterior portion? Anterior portion, it is actually, this is the hard palate. It is really hard, right? You can see the skull like this, and this is the hard palate, isn't it? So the anterior portion includes the hard palate along with the alveolar arch and the tooth. Okay, so the hard palate with the alveolar arch, you call this as the anterior portion. Hope that is clear. So in the Norma Basalis, the anterior portion is the hard palate with the alveolar process. Now, behind the hard palate, you have the middle portion, isn't it? So how far will you say it as the middle portion? You should have a boundary, right? So for that, what you're going to do is you are going to draw an imaginary line, or you have to imagine a plane where that plane should go. Okay, so this is the foramen magnum. The larger foramen in for Norma Basalis will be the foramen magnum. This you should never ever go wrong. I usually say a joke which I got in a Viva when I asked some of my students. It's just a joke, okay? I just showed this foramen and I just kept the skull like this and asked the student what passes through this foramen magnum. And without any doubt, you know what the answer was? Can anyone say? Any of my students here? I used to say this joke to almost every year because I really love that joke. So anyone? What passes through this foramen magnum? I don't want the real answer. I'm expecting, yeah, somewhere near. And the student just said foot passes through foramen magnum because when I kept it like this, he just thought the oral cavity is here, and I don't know. Foot passes through foramen magnum. Okay, so that was just a joke. So where to draw the line between the middle portion and the posterior portion? Where you're going to draw? You just keep a line in front of foramen magnum. Okay, you just keep a line in front of foramen magnum and in front of the styloid process. Okay, this is the styloid process. Most of the skull, it will be difficult for you to make out the styloid process because since it is long, it will just break off. Okay, so you just keep a line, imaginary line in front of the foramen magnum and in front of the styloid process. Okay, hope that is clear. And along the anterior margin of foramen magnum and in front of the styloid process. So if you keep a line like this will divide the remaining portion into middle and posterior. Okay, so it will be easy for you to say the features now. Okay, now we will move on with the anterior portion. This is the anterior portion and this is the hard palate. Okay, so the posteriorly, you know, this is the posterior border of the hard palate. This region is a posterior border. And in the middle, you can see a spine. Can you make out a spine here? This is the spine. This spine is known as posterior nasal spine. Okay, posterior nasal spine. In the last session, I have mentioned about anterior nasal spine. Hope you remember this. This is actually formed by the topmost portion of the intermaxillary suture. This is the anterior nasal spine. Along the posterior border of the hard palate, in the middle, you get the posterior nasal spine. I will come to the attachments later. Just for the time being, you just remember the posterior nasal spine. So when we ask about posterior nasal spine, we always tend to ask what are the other nasal spines you know about. So this is the posterior nasal spine, which is seen at the posterior border of the hard palate. This is the anterior nasal spine seen at the intermaxillary suture, top of the intermaxillary suture. And there is one more nasal spine. Any idea about the remaining nasal spine? Where will you get the one more nasal spine is there? Where will you look for it? Can anyone answer? It is in the frontal bone. Okay, here. The frontal bone will have a spine here in the middle. That is known as the nasal spine of frontal bone. So these are the three nasal spines which the examiners love to ask when they ask this point. Okay, so this is the posterior nasal spine. Then you have the alveolar arch. Okay, then you have the alveolar arch with the alveolar tooth sockets. Then what you have to say is, you have to talk about the bones forming the hard palate. Okay, so bones forming the hard palate, anteriorly, it is the palatine process of maxilla. This is the maxilla, right? You have the maxilla here. So the horizontal process of maxilla, it is known as the palatine process of maxilla, and it occupies the anterior 2/3. Up to this portion, you have the palatine process of maxilla, and the remaining portion, it is actually formed by the horizontal plate of palatine bone. Okay, horizontal plate of palatine bone. Now, when we talk about this palatine bone is actually L-shaped. Okay, so the palatine bone is actually L-shaped. So when I keep this L like this is the horizontal plate of palatine bone. Hope you can imagine. The remaining portion goes inside. Okay, so this horizontal portion is known as the horizontal plate of palatine bone. So these are the two major bones forming the hard palate. Anterior 2/3 by the palatine process of maxilla, and the posterior 1/3 by the horizontal plate of palatine bone. And you can see many depressions. It is not as smooth, isn't it? It is there. You can get many depressions, and these depressions are due to the palatine glands. The palatine glands cause the impressions, and they are seen as depressions over the hard palate. Now we have to talk about the important sutures which you see in the hard palate. Which are the important sutures you see? You can see a cross-like suture. Can you see a cross-like suture? One vertical and one horizontal. So this is known as cruciform suture. Okay, so in the hard palate, you get the cruciform suture. Now, how is this cruciform suture formed? In the anterior 2/3, it is the intermaxillary suture. And in the posterior 1/3, it is the interpalatine suture. And between the maxilla and palate, you have the palatomaxillary suture. Okay, so the cruciform suture is made up of intermaxillary in the anterior 2/3, interpalatine in the posterior 1/3, and between the maxilla and palatine bone, you have the palatomaxillary suture. So altogether, you have a cruciform suture. Hope the the sutures are clear to you. Now we will move on to some other features. Can you see a fossa here? Can you see a fossa here? This fossa just lies closer to the incisors, isn't it? So this fossa is known as incisive fossa. Okay, incisive fossa. The peculiarity of this incisive fossa is two foramina opens into the incisive fossa. From this view, it is difficult to see. You have to split it open to see one foramen coming from right side and the other foramen coming from left side. So two foramina opens into this incisive fossa. They are the right and left incisive foramen. Okay, so two foramina opens into the incisive fossa. Now, what else? Now you have to go for the another bigger foramen. It's not that as big as the incisive fossa, but still bigger foramen, just posterior to the palatomaxillary suture. What is this foramen known as? You can see it on either side. This is known as greater palatine foramen. Don't worry about the contents and the structures, how they are attached. I will be talking about it in detail. But if I go about this, talking about the structures, attachments, contents like that, it will be difficult for you to grasp. So first, make sure that the next time you take the skull, it is clear for you what are the main parts of the skull. Okay, so and one more suggestion from my part is whenever you sit for this class, especially the osteology class, you also have a specimen in your hand. Then it will be easy for you to understand, because everything imagining it will be difficult. So this is a greater palatine foramen. Hope that is clear. Now you can see this is the palatine bone, and there is a prolongation of the palatine bone. Okay, so this prolongation is known as the pyramidal process of palatine bone. Okay, so this prolongation is known as the pyramidal process of palatine bone. And what you get in the pyramidal process? You get another foramen. Okay, you can see 1 to 3, maximum 3 foramina you can expect here. So these foramina are known as lesser palatine foramina. Okay, so incisive fossa here, then you have the greater palatine foramen on either side, and in the pyramidal process of palatine bone, you can get up to 3 lesser palatine foramina. Okay, so that is about the palatine foramen. Now, when you go to the posterior border, can you see a shade difference here? Can you appreciate this? It is seen as well as felt better. Okay, if you just go from the posterior part, you can see an elevation. If you just glide your fingers, you can see you will meet an elevation. This is known as palatine crest. Okay, so this is known as the palatine crest. Just near the posterior border, you have the palatine crest. And one more important point as far as the hard palate is concerned is a portion known as premaxilla. In the anterior-most portion, there is a region known as premaxilla. Sometimes the examiners would like to ask about this question. What do you mean by premaxilla? So premaxilla is a triangular piece of cake in the anterior portion. Okay, with the apex at the intermaxillary suture and the base you have, yes, primary palate, very good. And the base you have the 4 incisors. Okay, the base you have 4 incisors and the apex meets at the intermaxillary suture. So this triangular piece is known as premaxilla. Okay, so embryologically speaking, that is known as premaxilla. And so that's about the anterior portion of the Norma Basalis. Now we are moving on to the middle portion. Okay, now we are moving on to the middle portion. So hope it's clear for you till now. Can I get a feedback so that I can proceed with the middle portion? Is it okay? Okay. Now we will move on with the middle portion. So middle portion again, to say it or to explain it more clearly, we are going to divide into a middle portion or a medial portion and 2 lateral portion. Okay, so a median portion and 2 lateral portion. That is how we are going to explain the middle portion. Hi Shivakumar, you want to get an explanation for premaxilla once again? Premaxilla is a triangular region in the anterior portion of the hard palate with the apex onto the intermaxillary suture and the base includes the 4 incisors. Or premaxilla, you can say that it includes the 4 incisors. Okay, now we are moving on to the middle portion. For explanation purpose, you can divide it as a median portion and 2 lateral portions. Okay, median portion and 2 lateral portions. First, we will see the median portion. What are the features in the median portion? It starts with the 2 openings. Can you see the 2 openings? So these two openings are the posterior nasal aperture. Okay, posterior nasal aperture. Anteriorly, you have seen a big anterior nasal aperture, isn't it? Likewise, you can see a posterior nasal aperture. So, do you know another name given to this nasal aperture? Posterior nasal aperture? Can you say another name given to this posterior nasal aperture? Can anyone say? That is known as choane. It's not concha, it is choane. Okay, choane. The posterior nasal aperture is otherwise known as choane. Okay. Now, when you look at the posterior nasal aperture, actually the septum is not seen here properly. In the middle, you can see the vomer bone. Okay, the posterior border of vomer is seen in the middle, and on either side, you can see the posterior border of vomer flaring laterally. They are known as the ala of vomer. Okay, ala of vomer. So the posterior border of vomer and on either side it is spreading out and that is known as ala of vomer. Hope that is clear. Now, just behind that you can see a broad bar. Can you see a broad bar here in the middle? This is a broad bar, isn't it? From the posterior nasal aperture till the anterior margin of foramen magnum, you can see a broad bar. Hope that is clear for you. So this broad bar includes what are the bones forming this broad bar? You have to say that. Here you get the sphenoid. Okay, anteriorly you get the sphenoid, and this is the occipital bone. Okay, so this is the basilar portion of the occipital bone. So these two bones meet and they join, and this middle portion, this middle broad bar is formed by the body of sphenoid as well as the basilar portion of the occipital bone. So these two bones are forming the middle region, and they extend from the posterior nasal aperture up to the anterior margin of foramen magnum. Hope that is also clear. Now, one more important feature in the middle region is when you trace your finger along the middle region, you can see an elevation in the midline. Okay, you can see an elevation in the midline. This elevation, can you see this elevation? This elevation is known as, hope you can see this elevation. And for osteology, most of the features, fine features are better felt than seen. So I think, yeah, it is the pharyngeal tubercle. Hi, Nimita. It is the pharyngeal tubercle. Very good. Okay, now I'm not mentioning about the attachments right now. I'll come with the attachments. So please have a bone in your hand so that it will be easy for you whenever I mention all these features. So this is known as the pharyngeal tubercle. So these are the features of the middle portion, starting from the posterior, hi Soumya, from the posterior nasal aperture up to the anterior margin of foramen magnum. You have the posterior border of vomer with two ala. Then you have the bone formed by the body of sphenoid as well as the basilar portion of the occipital bone, and then you have in the middle the pharyngeal tubercle. Okay, so this is about the middle portion. Now we will move on with the two lateral portions. So in the lateral portion, what is the first structure which you see? You can see two legs, isn't it? This is one leg and this is the other leg. So these two legs are known as the pterygoid process. Okay, these are the pterygoid process. Okay, so these are the pterygoid process. So here you can see the medial pterygoid plate, and here you can see the lateral pterygoid plate. Hope that is clear. Likewise here also the medial pterygoid plate, and this is the lateral pterygoid plate. So this as such you call it as pterygoid process. Hope that is clear. Now, here you have the pterygoid fossa. Okay, so this is known as the pterygoid fossa. Now, we know this is the lateral pterygoid plate. So, each pterygoid plate has got a lateral surface and a medial surface. Okay, so if you consider this as a lateral pterygoid plate, this is the lateral surface and this is the medial surface. Similarly, when you consider the medial pterygoid plate, this will be the lateral surface and this will be the medial surface. You should know this, very important, because when we discuss about the pterygoid muscle, the lateral and medial pterygoids, you need to know this in detail. Just for the time being, do you know with respect to which pterygoid plate the pterygoid muscle is named as lateral pterygoid and medial pterygoid? Any idea? We have the medial pterygoid plate and lateral pterygoid plate, right? With respect to which pterygoid plate, lateral or medial pterygoid plate, you have named the pterygoids as lateral pterygoid and medial pterygoid? This is again one of the favorite questions which we use, which we usually ask for the Viva. Yes, Shivakumar, yes, Pavitra. Yes, it is with respect to the lateral pterygoid plate. If you have the origin from the lateral surface of lateral pterygoid plate, it is lateral pterygoid. If you have the origin from the medial surface of lateral pterygoid plate, it is the medial pterygoid muscle. Okay, so I just wanted to give one important part related to this. So that's about the medial and lateral surface of lateral and medial pterygoid plates. Now, for the time being, can you say what is the relation of this lateral surface of lateral pterygoid plate? This is a lateral surface of lateral pterygoid plate. Which is this fossa? If I keep it like this, which is this fossa? This is temporal region, and this is below the temporal, you have the infratemporal region. Okay, so the lateral surface of lateral pterygoid plate, actually, yes, Menti, good, lateral. I think most of you know that. So the lateral surface of lateral pterygoid plate is actually forming the medial wall of infratemporal fossa. That is one important point you need to know. Okay. Now you have the pterygoid fossa. So pterygoid fossa is bounded by the medial surface of lateral pterygoid plate and the lateral surface of medial pterygoid plate. Hope that is clear. Pterygoid fossa is bounded by medial surface of lateral pterygoid plate and lateral surface of medial pterygoid plate. And coming to the medial surface of medial pterygoid plate, it is actually forming the boundary of choana or posterior nasal aperture. I think up to this, it is clear for you, isn't it? We are moving to the lateral portion from the midline. There we met two pterygoid plates. They are together known as the pterygoid process, medial and lateral pterygoid plates. Both have a lateral surface and a medial surface. Between the plates, you have the pterygoid fossa. Now we mentioned about the infratemporal fossa and the relation of the lateral surface of lateral pterygoid plate. Then we mentioned about the pterygoid fossa. Then also mentioned about the medial surface of medial pterygoid plate, which is forming the choana. Now here we already mentioned about the pterygoid process, isn't it, of the palatine bone. So this pterygoid process is articulating with a fissure in the lower portion. Actually, lower portion means usually we keep it here like this, isn't it? Zygomatic arch is this. Okay. This is a zygomatic arch. So the pyramidal process will actually fit into a fissure between the two plates in the lower part. So this fissure is named as pterygoid fissure. So the pyramidal process of palatine bone fits into a gap between the two pterygoid plates in the lower part. That is known as pterygoid fissure. So that's about the pterygoid fissure. Now there are some more features for the medial pterygoid plate. Now the features which I'm going to say is for the medial pterygoid plate. There are mainly three features for the medial pterygoid plate. Let's see what are they. In the upper portion means it is actually, I have kept it upside down. Okay, so don't worry why I'm saying it is upside. Okay, so the upper portion, this is the medial pterygoid plate, right? It splits into two to enclose a fossa. Can you see a fossa here? So this fossa is known as scaphoid fossa. Okay, so this is known as scaphoid fossa. I've colored it. So the medial pterygoid plate, the posterior border, if you trace it upwards, it splits into two to enclose a fossa that is known as scaphoid fossa. Similarly, when you go down and down, the lower part, you can see a projection. There is a small projection. It will be a bit more prominent, but it will be usually broken off. It will usually break off just like the styloid process. Okay, here also it is broken. So this tip is known as pterygoid hamulus. The importance of the pterygoid hamulus, I will mention it in the next class, and I will mention the muscle which is actually winding around it. Okay, so the tip of this is known as the pterygoid hamulus. And in between the scaphoid fossa and pterygoid hamulus, you can feel a pyramidal type of elevation or a small elevation. Can you just name this elevation? Can anyone mention the elevation along the posterior border of the medial pterygoid between the pterygoid hamulus and the scaphoid fossa? Can you mention this? This is known as, can anyone say? Processus tubarius. Okay, in the middle of the posterior border of medial pterygoid plate, you have a projection. Can you see this projection? This projection. So this is known as, what is that? Processus tubarius. Okay, that is known as processus tubarius. Now we will move a bit laterally, and this is actually the infratemporal surface of the greater wing of sphenoid. So all these, this is the body of sphenoid, this is the pterygoid process of sphenoid. Now we are going to talk about the greater wing of sphenoid. Okay, so the greater wing of sphenoid, you can see that this is roughly pentagonal in shape. Okay, so this is roughly pentagonal in shape, and this is actually forming the roof of the infratemporal fossa. Okay, so the greater wing of sphenoid is actually forming the roof of infratemporal fossa. Now we have to say which are the openings which you get in the roof, in the greater wing of sphenoid. Okay, so if you have studied about the middle cranial fossa in the interior of the skull, I do all these sessions. So if you have studied about the middle cranial fossa in the greater wing of sphenoid, there were three openings: foramen rotundum, foramen ovale, and foramen spinosum. You can remember it. The mnemonic is my name, ROS, from anterior to posterior: rotundum, ovale, and spinosum. But when you come to the Norma Basalis, which opening is not seen among these three? Can you say which opening is not seen among the rotundum, ovale, and spinosum? Can anyone say? So these are the two openings in the greater wing. Yes, very good. So foramen rotundum. Yes, very good, Fasi. Foramen rotundum is not seen. So which is the next opening? It is foramen ovale, and after that you have the foramen spinosum. Rotundum is not seen here. It is actually opening into pterygopalatine fossa. Okay, that is very, very important. So that is actually seen here through the pterygomaxillary fissure. You can reach the pterygopalatine fossa, that is between the pterygoid process and our palatine bone. So that is actually a hidden fossa. You have to disarticulate. But when you disarticulate, what happens? All the bones will be separated and there won't be any fossa. When you articulate it, it is actually a hidden fossa, and the door to that hidden fossa is pterygomaxillary fissure. Okay, so here you cannot show the pterygopalatine fossa. So out of the three openings in the middle cranial fossa, only ovale and spinosum. So in the greater wing of sphenoid, you have to check for these two openings. Okay, one is ovale and the other one is spinosum. Okay, and two more additional openings might be present. One is known as foramen of Vesalius and the other one is canaliculus innominatus. Okay, these are again asked. Foramen lesino, I'll come to it, Nisha. Please wait. Okay, so in front of foramen ovale, you might get foramen of Vesalius, and between ovale and spinosum, you might get canaliculus innominatus. So these are the two other openings you can expect as a variation. Okay, in front of ovale, foramen of Vesalius, and between ovale and spinosum, you can expect canaliculus innominatus. Understood? I will talk about the structures passing through it later. Now, the next important thing is you have to trace for the spine of sphenoid. Most of you will land up saying this as a spine of sphenoid. This is a styloid process. We'll come to it. So how will you trace the spine of sphenoid? The best way is I always ask the students to trace your finger like this along the ovale, along the spinosum, and it ends in a prominence. It will be more prominent in a good specimen. So this prominence is the spine of sphenoid. It will, of course, lie in front of the styloid process. So you just trace your finger along the ovale and spinosum, foramen spinosum, and you will end up in a bony projection. That is known as spine of sphenoid. Okay. Now, okay. Questions to get good marks without spending much time on single question. I didn't get you. Please tell how to attempt questions to get good marks without spending much time on single. Yeah, okay. I will come to all these things. Let me finish this topic. Okay. So now one more thing is how far you have to go with this greater wing. Can you see an elevation here? Can you see an elevation here? This is the limit of the lateral limit of the greater wing. Can you see this elevation? What do you call this? Can anyone say this elevation? This is known as the infratemporal crest. Okay, the infratemporal crest. So this is the limit of the greater wing of sphenoid. You should not go beyond this in Norma Basalis. So this elevation is known as infratemporal crest. Now we have what all things we have seen. We have discussed about the pterygoid process, the pterygoid fossa, the plates, the two plates. Then we have mentioned about the greater wing of sphenoid. Then we mentioned about the rotundum. Rotundum is not opening here. We have mentioned about the ovale and spinosum. You see a depression here. This is known as sulcus tubae. Okay, this is known as sulcus tubae. This is an elongated groove. Okay, so this is known as sulcus tubae. Then after that, uh, then you come to the petrous part of temporal bone. So this irregular piece of bone is known as the petrous part of temporal bone. Okay, hope this is clear. This is the petrous part of temporal bone. So after sulcus tubae, you end up with the petrous part of temporal bone. Greater wing of sphenoid is this. This one is the greater wing of sphenoid. Okay. On either side, you have the greater wing of sphenoid. So this is the petrous part of temporal bone. So the petrous part of temporal bone has got an apex which articulates with the sphenoid bone. Here you get an irregular foramen. Can you see an irregular foramen? This foramen is known as foramen lacerum. Many of you were asking. So just behind the sulcus tubae, you have the petrous part of temporal bone which articulates with the body of sphenoid, and at the apex you get an irregular foramen. This is known as foramen lacerum. Importance of foramen lacerum is when you talk about ovale spinosum and all, if you take an individual sphenoid bone, you can show those foramina, isn't it? But when you talk about foramen lacerum, you can show this foramen lacerum only in an articulated skull. If you separate the temporal bone, if you separate the sphenoid bone, you cannot show foramen lacerum because foramen lacerum is not a foramen seen in a single bone. It is formed only when the bones articulate. When the body sphenoid articulates with the apex of the petrous part of temporal bone, you will get the foramen lacerum. And two canals opens into the foramen lacerum. One is carotid canal and the other one is pterygoid canal. Okay, carotid canal and pterygoid canal. Just like we discussed about the incisive fossa, the right and left incisive foramina, we have the foramen lacerum, into which you have the two important canals opening. From posterior, you have the carotid canal, and from anterior, you can see the pterygoid canal. Okay, so these will be explained from the interior aspect more clearly. Okay, now after the apex, you can see a quadrangular region. Can you appreciate a quadrangular region in the petrous part of the temporal bone? This is the quadrangular region. And after that, the canal, the bigger canal which you see, that is the carotid canal. Okay, so the bigger canal which you see is the carotid canal. Now, one more important point which I would like to mention is when you discuss about the carotid canal is actually opening into the posterior part of the foramen lacerum. You have to add that point also. Okay, so this carotid canal, this bigger canal in the petrous part of temporal bone is actually opening into the posterior portion of the foramen lacerum. So that's something coming in the middle portion. Now, don't talk about the styloid process and jugular and all because they are coming in the posterior portion. For the time being, please don't mention. Then in this plane, if you go laterally, you can see the temporal bone, the remaining portions of the temporal bone. So this portion, a thin plate, this is known as the tympanic plate of temporal bone. Hope you can make out this. This is known as the tympanic plate of temporal bone. And the remaining portion, this is a larger squamous part of temporal bone. Only a small portion of squamous part comes here in the Norma Basalis. So we can say about the squamous part of temporal bone. This is actually the fossa, mandibular fossa. Okay, can you see the mandibular fossa? Then you have the articular tubercle. Okay, this is the articular tubercle. This is a mandibular fossa. This is the articular tubercle, and this is actually a small portion coming as the roof of the infratemporal fossa. Okay, so this is the squamous part of temporal bone. This is the tympanic part of temporal bone, and this is the petrous part of temporal bone. These are the different portions of temporal bone. So in the petrous part of temporal bone, we mentioned about foramen lacerum, the quadrangular portion, and the carotid canal. Then you have the tympanic plate of temporal bone. Then you have the squamous part where you get the mandibular fossa. This small projection is known as the articular tubercle, and this portion is a part which is again coming as the roof of the infratemporal fossa. Okay, now I will add one more point and stop. This is actually the tympanic plate, isn't it? This is the tympanic plate and this is the squamous plate. So can you see a fissure here? Between the tympanic plate and squamous plate, can you see a fissure here? This is a squamous plate, this is a tympanic plate. So what do you call this fissure? Can anyone say? That is known as, yes, please say, what is this fissure? Known as, this fissure is known as squamotympanic fissure. Okay, so that is known as squamotympanic fissure. And what happens to the squamotympanic fissure? This petrous part in the interior, there is a portion of the petrous part, a bone of the petrous part known as tegment tympani. Okay, so that tegment tympani will come out, a portion of it will come out through this squamotympanic fissure. Okay, it will just come out through the squamotympanic fissure, and I will just show it like this. It will just come out through the squamotympanic fissure like this. Okay, it will peep through the squamotympanic fissure. So, or you can just imagine, I'm not getting any fine thing. Okay, if you think like this, a tegment tympani portion will come through the squamotympanic fissure, and it will divide the squamotympanic fissure into. So if this tegment tympani is considered as a part of petrous part, so anteriorly the gap is between the petrous and the squamous part, isn't it? So this region you call it as petrosquamous, and posteriorly you call it as petrotympanic. Okay, so the squamotympanic fissure is divided by a portion of petrous part of temporal bone from the interior. That portion is known as tegment tympani. And that it usually projects into this gap and divides the squamotympanic fissure into two. Since this tegment tympani is a part of petrous part, you use that petrous part to divide the squamotympanic fissure into two. So the one lying closer to the squamous part, you call it as petrosquamous, and the one lying closer to the tympanic part, you call it as petrotympanic. Hope that is clear. That is how the squamotympanic fissure is divided into petrosquamous anteriorly and petrotympanic posteriorly. That is how the squamotympanic fissure is divided. So I think we have covered the features of the middle region as well. The middle portion and the two lateral portions. So in the beginning, you might feel like there are many foramina, many sutures, etc. But once you study, then you will be seeing only the important ones, isn't it? Now, if I just show it like this, it will be easy for you. You won't think about any other foramen other than foramen ovale and foramen spinosum, isn't it? If I show a horizontally horizontal groove, this is sulcus tubae, isn't it? Then if I show a foramen at the apex of the petrous part of temporal bone, it is foramen lacerum, nothing else. Then if I show a foramen in the petrous part of temporal bone, just behind foramen lacerum, it is carotid canal, isn't it? So is temporal and mandibular fossa same? Mandibular fossa is actually, well, what do you get in the mandibular fossa? Can anyone see? Mandibular fossa, what happens in the mandibular fossa? It articulates with the head of what? Mandibular fossa is here. It articulates with what? Head of mandible to form temporomandibular joint. Okay, so it's always good to say it as mandibular fossa because temporal region, infratemporal fossa is there. So please don't confuse with the mandibular fossa as temporal fossa. It is better to name it as mandibular fossa, or you will get it confused with the temporal region and the infratemporal region. Okay, so that's about the anterior and middle portion of the Norma Basalis. In a nutshell, I haven't mentioned about the structures and the attachments and the structures passing through it. I will do another session on the posterior region of the Norma Basalis along with the structures attached in another session. Is it not clear? I think Nisha is asking to zoom it. You were not able to see. I was just trying my level best because this is a maximum zoom possible. Okay, since I'm just going live, this is the maximum zoom possible. If you're not able to make out, please let me know. Okay, I think most of you could understand something, at least something about everything, or everything about something, isn't it? So thank you so much. Thank you for being here. Please let me know if the session is useful for you. And if you find it useful, please share with your friends and please ask them to subscribe and keep me motivated to do more and more videos. Yeah, cerebrum. Yeah, definitely. Just time constraints, but I'll try my level best. Okay, so thank you so much. Have a great evening. Good night.